This tutorial is for 4th grade, Module 5, Lesson 14. In this lesson, we're going to think about unit fractions and the patterns that we see when the denominator changes in our fractions. The first statement says, as the number in the denominator gets bigger, the size of the fraction gets blank. I have 3 pictures of fractions off to the side, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5. You can see each time that my denominator gets bigger by 1. But if you look at the size of the fraction gets smaller. If we think about that logically, the denominator is telling me how many pieces I'm cutting my whole into. 1/3 meant that I cut the whole into 3 pieces. 1/5 meant that I cut the whole into 5 pieces. The more pieces I cut the whole into, the smaller those pieces would get. It's logical then to say, as the number in the denominator gets bigger, the size of the fraction gets smaller. And again, it's important to note that we're talking about the size of the fraction. Now we can use this idea to compare our fractions. In question A, I have 1/4, and I'm comparing it to 1/5. I have 1 for the numerator of each fraction. A 1/4 would be larger than a 1/5 because I've only cut my whole into 4 pieces instead of 5. So 1/4 is greater than 1/5. Now, if I look at those same pieces, I have 3 of those 4ths, and I also have 3 of the 5ths. Well, each 5th is going to be smaller than each 4th. Since I have 3 of each piece, my 4ths are still greater than my 5ths. 3/4 is greater than 3/5. We'll use that same logic in this section. The directions say to compare by reasoning about the following pairs of fractions with the same numerators. 1/5 tells me that my whole has been cut into 5 pieces, where 1/6 tells me the whole has been cut into 6 pieces. Well, those 6ths would be smaller than the 5ths because there's more pieces. That tells me that 1/5 is greater than 1/6. The larger the denominator, the smaller the piece. Then using that same logic, I have 4 of those 5ths, and I'm comparing it to 4 of the 6ths. Since I have the same number of pieces for each, the 5ths would still be larger than the 6th. In question B, I'm comparing 1/4 to 1/3. The bigger the denominator, the smaller the piece. That means since 4 is bigger than 3, 1/4 is going to be smaller than 1/3. If I have 2/4 then, and I'm comparing it to 2/3, 2/4 would still be smaller because I have the same number of pieces, but my 4ths are smaller than my 3rds. In question C, I'm comparing 1/8 to 1/4. 8 is bigger than 4, so I've cut my whole into 8 pieces compared to cutting it into 4 pieces. The 1/8 would be smaller than the 4ths. That means if I have 3 of each piece, my 1/8 will still be smaller than the 4ths. 3/8 is less than 3/4. We're going to continue with comparisons in this section. Here I'm comparing 2/3 to 5/6. I have 2 tape diagrams stacked on top of each other. The top part is showing my 1/3s, and the bottom part is showing my 6ths. What you might notice is every time we have 1/3, we have 2 6ths that are equal to the 1/3. So that can help with our comparison. I'm going to shade in each fraction to show the difference between the two. Here's my representation of both fractions, and you can see that 5/6 is greater than 2/3. If we had only had 4/6, we would have had the same amount because that fraction would have stopped at the end of the 2/3. But that extra 6th shows us that it is a greater fraction. So 2/3 is less than 5/6. And in the last section, we'll do our comparisons on the number line. Here I'm comparing 2/6 to 5/12. I'll start by plotting each fraction on the number line. The top one has been divided into 6 I just need to start at the 0 and count over 2 sixths. So I have 0 sixth, 1 sixth, 2 sixths. So there's my 2 sixths. And I'm comparing that to 5 twelfths. Start at the 0 and just count over 5 twelfths. I have 0 twelfths, 1 twelfth, 2 twelfths, 3 twelfths, 4 twelfths, 5 twelfths. Now when we make our comparison, you can see, if you look for each sixth, I have 2 twelfths. So since I have 2 sixths, that was the same as 4 twelfths, but then my second fraction actually is 5 twelfths. That shows me how 5 twelfths is a bigger fraction. That means that 2 sixths is less than 5 twelfths. It's helpful for students to see these fractions in a variety of visual ways to help make the connection between the numbers and the actual fractions themselves.